We will now learn about the respiratory system. I'm sure we all know the primary job of our respiratory system is to allow gas exchange between the body and the atmosphere. This gas exchange is an exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we intake oxygen and we remove carbon dioxide using our respiratory system. As you should also know, the function of oxygen has to do with our metabolism. We require oxygen to perform cellular respiration. That oxygen is utilized during a process known as the electron transport chain. This allows us to gain energy from molecules that contain energy, such as carbohydrates, protein, and lipid. So I think we all knew we need to breathe to get that oxygen. Just as important is to get rid of that carbon dioxide. What you may not know is that carbon dioxide, if we cannot remove it, it turns our body very acidic. So the buildup of carbon dioxide causes acidosis. So it's just as important to get rid of that CO2 as it is to get our oxygen. We probably also know our respiratory tract is involved in our sense of smell or olfaction. We use our internal nasal cavity, and we have olfactory neurons that are housed in the upper part of our nasal cavity. It also helps us produce sounds. Finally, it helps us excrete small amounts of water and heat. You usually don't think about that, but we lose a little bit of water through exhalation, and we can remove a little bit of the heat that's generated by the body. But let's look at the primary function of our respiratory system. And this has to do with the exchange of gases between the environmental air and eventually our bloodstream. Then our cardiovascular system will transport these gases. Doing gas exchange occurs in three primary steps. The first step is the process of breathing, known as pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation involves, obviously, our lungs, because the atmospheric air, has to enter the lungs during inhalation and exit the lungs during exhalation. But the major organs that allow you to breathe are muscles, the diaphragm, external intercostals being the most important. So we'll look at the process of ventilation and focus mostly on the muscles that are involved, but also how pressure changes move this air in or out of the lungs. The next step is to do gas exchange between the air in the lungs and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries. This is known as external respiration or pulmonary respiration. Pulmonary in reference to the lungs. But this process is the exchange of gases via diffusion between the air spaces in the lungs, known as alveoli, and the blood in pulmonary capillaries. The third step is known as tissue respiration or internal respiration. This is the exchange of gases, again by diffusion, between blood in systemic capillaries and tissue cells. And then we all remember aerobic cellular respiration is the process that uses the oxygen and produces the carbon dioxide. But that happens inside of our cells. Who's responsible for these three major steps? The respiratory system carries out really the first two. Your respiratory system allows you to get oxygen into the bloodstream and get carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream and eventually back into the atmosphere. Your cardiovascular system really carries out the third step because that's found at systemic capillaries throughout the body and tissue cells. So looking at the anatomy of the respiratory system, many of these organs we've heard of. We've heard of our nose, we've heard of our throat or pharynx. Our larynx or voice box contains vocal cords. The trachea or windpipe, bronchi, which come in different generations. There's a primary, a secondary, a tertiary. Eventually we lead to small airways called bronchioles that are all found within the lungs. We divide up the respiratory system either anatomically or functionally. We're going to first look at the anatomical divisions. We have what's known as the upper respiratory tract, which is everything above the larynx. So that includes your nasal cavity, your pharynx, which actually has 3 regions that we will look at. So that's classically considered the upper respiratory tract. Lower respiratory tract starts at your larynx, which houses your vocal cords, continues down to the trachea, the bronchi, which again, there's generations of those. Primary, which there's 2. There's a right and left primary bronchus, which lead into the lungs. Secondary, those supply each lobe. So there's a difference in lobes between the right and left lung. If you notice, there's 3 lobes here on the right lung. There's only 2 lobes of the left lung. So there's 3 secondary bronchi on the right and 2 secondary bronchi on the left. Tertiary bronchi go to these smaller segments within a lobe of a lung. Then they branch into smaller bronchioles smaller airways known as bronchioles. And then they end up being named terminal bronchioles and then respiratory bronchioles. And then finally the alveoli, which are the small air sacs. So this is how we divide up the respiratory system anatomically. Basically, everything above the vocal cords is upper, everything below the vocal cords is lower, but we typically put the larynx in the lower respiratory tract. Next way we can think of our respiratory tract is functionally. We have the areas of the tract that conduct air or move air. These airways also warm the air, filter the air, and add water vapor to the air so that they humidify the air. So the conducting zone moves air but also gets it ready for gas exchange. But the key difference is there's no actual gas exchange that occurs along the conduction zone. And notice most of your respiratory tract is conducting. It's moving that air. The larger structures, the nose, your throat, the larynx, the trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and then finally the end of these bronchioles are known as terminal bronchioles. Terminal bronchioles, terminal means the end, but it's the end of the conduction zone. So these airways do not provide any gas exchange, but instead gets that air ready. We have to have it warmed up, we have to have it cleaned, filtered, we have to have it humidified. There has to be moisture to promote proper gas exchange. So then the respiratory zone is the area of your respiratory tract that can actually exchange oxygen and CO2 with blood in the pulmonary capillaries. There are respiratory bronchioles, which are a continuation of the terminal. So terminal bronchioles become respiratory bronchioles that lead to alveolar ducts, which provide air to an alveolar sac, which is many alveoli, kind of looks like a cluster of grapes. And then each individual air sac is known as an alveolus or alveoli for plural. So these are areas of the tract that we can actually do gas exchange between the air in the lungs in these structures and blood in the pulmonary capillaries.